Usually, when I write a novel, I start out with the germ of a character that propels the story. The idea that I begin with is a character, a whacked character. I've had an erotomaniac who stalked someone, and we have to go all the way through the book to find out that she's completely unreliable. I've had an extremely obnoxious, racist old woman, and we have to wait for her to redeem herself all the way through the book. But this time, instead, I wrote the book that everyone had said long ago that I was born to write. I've started with what I guess is the central tragedy of my childhood. My father carried with him all the years that he was alive what you'd call survivor guilt. He was an escapee from Nazi Germany, and he had to leave at the age of 23 without his mother. The Nazis had invaded Poland, and it was the last possible time to leave, and he had to tell his mother goodbye. She wouldn't leave, she wouldn't go with him, and he escaped at the last possible second, and for the rest of his life he was tormented by his guilt. So that colored the atmosphere of my childhood home. Well, what makes my father's story interesting is that he wound up fairly shortly after he came to the States in what I would call a mixed marriage. He joined the United States Army, and he came through New Orleans, and here he met my mother, who was a spoiled uptown Jewish American princess in a thoroughly assimilated Reformed Jewish family. He was living in an environment that was probably just as filled with prejudice and pain for him as living in Nazi Germany was. He came to New Orleans, and he moved into what was a very assimilated, Reformed Jewish community that was full of kind of self-hatred for themselves as being Jewish, and he was way too Jewish.
In the book, they do some rather terrible things to the father character, Bernie. Did they do that in real life to your father?
They didn't do the same things to my father as his in-laws do in the book, but my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, were very horrible to my father. They cut off any financial support to my mother at one point, and when my grandmother died, they put my mother in trust, specifying that she would not get a penny from the estate until my father died, which was a slam, just a slam to him. I wanted to illustrate.
Yeah, that's fiction. That's exactly right. It's metaphor.
What kind of a subliminal prejudice my grandparents and their relatives all had toward this poor man who could not help having this accent and having these, deficits that he came to this country with.
And was his religion important to him?
I think it had been. He was an observant Jew. He did not eat the kinds of foods that are really, part and parcel of New Orleans cuisine. I mean, pork and seafood, it's hard to miss those things when you have red beans and rice. You're going to have pickled pork in it, and you're going to have fried seafood on any platter here. And my poor father wound up just giving up, pretty much giving up, in order to be assimilated into that family. And I don't know, I guess he just internalized it. I sometimes think now, gee, what if he had had Prozac? Gee, what if he had been stigmatized by the idea of going and talking to a therapist? There were therapists back then, but it was nothing he was willing to do. Instead, he just had all these psychosomatic difficulties.
Like Bernie in the book. But she does have a great relationship with her father. Is that
Yes.
true of you?
That was true of me. I was my father's special kid. And that is one of the reasons why this is the book I was born to write, because I feel as though I'm the only person who really understood him and delighted in him and felt terrific compassion for him. And I want to vindicate him with this book. I want, my grandparents, of course, are deceased. My mother is deceased. But there are a lot of people alive who knew him. And although it doesn't really matter, it's for posterity, for his image to have been kind of burnished a little better. To tell his story right, to make it understood how badly he was treated in this community and how wonderful a person he was. I think that in a lot of ways that this book was a fantasy of mine, that I wanted it to be this way, that here I, the Darby character, was the product of this marriage where the only thing that mattered between the parents was continuing to stick it out, to figure something out, always somehow to find a place where they could be together. The Letty character wants to somehow triumph, that she can make herself feel good in spite of what her parents want. And Bernie can prove himself despite low expectations of him. And I think I wanted them to come together and make it. And that's the way I did the fiction. That was the joy of writing this book, of making things up that felt good. And one of the things that I went through personally, and I think this is a little bit tangential to it, and yet I want to talk about it because it's so wonderful for myself, is that Bernie, in the opening scene of the book, which is probably the most painful one, leaves his mother in Germany. And it was hard to write that from the point of view of a 23-year-old man walking away, and you realize, of course, in the course of the novel, that he will never see her again. And all my life, this was very painful for me. And yet, in 2005, Hurricane Katrina came to New Orleans. And I was the mother of a 20-year-old young man. And he kept begging me to leave. And I didn't leave. And my son went to Houston, and I stayed in New Orleans. And my son cried the whole time he was in Houston, thinking I was dead. And when I showed up, all of a sudden it didn't matter anymore to him. Okay, Mom's all right, forget about it. I'm going off to see my friends. And I realized I was in the position of my grandmother, who had sent her son off. And no longer did I feel so bad about the grandmother who had died in Germany. And it helped me a lot as I wrote this book to think about the woman who had died in the camps in Germany. And even though I could not tell my father who had lost his mother, I somehow could write the book with this feeling of his being forgiven.